Good afternoon, and welcome to this extraordinary opportunity to explore through the experience and witness of a young man imprisoned for 14 years at the detainee camp in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, without being charged with a crime, the fraught issues of extrajudicial punishment, human rights, the rule of law, and national security. My name is Scott Appleby, and I'm the Dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs. Through research, engaged scholarship, and teaching, the Keough School seeks to advance integral human development, a holistic vision of human flourishing based on the inherent dignity of each person. Notre Dame's Center for Civil and Human Rights, the organizer and host of our discussion today, is an invaluable part of the Keough School and an essential contributor to Notre Dame's mission to, quote, create a sense of human solidarity and concern for the common good that will bear fruit as learning becomes service to justice. The center was founded in 1973 by Father Ted Hesburgh to ensure that Notre Dame remained at the forefront of the fight for civil and human rights. Its director is Jennifer Mason McAward, a civil rights expert, legal scholar, and professor in Notre Dame's law school. I'm grateful to Jen for her dedicated and inspired leadership of the Center for Civil and Human Rights. The theme this year of Father Jenkins' annual Notre Dame Forum is Going Global, exploring the challenges and opportunities of globalization. Today's featured event in the forum, as you will see, is global in theme and participation. I challenge all of us to learn from our distinguished guests, also to begin to discern how we will concretely address the injustices that prevent nations and peoples from realizing the dream of a world and a political order characterized by fairness to all and the rule of law. For any event of this complexity and importance to succeed, there must be a person of passion, insight, and commitment at its center. Happily for us, that person is Chris Cervanek, Associate Director of the Center for Civil and Human Rights. Without Chris's tireless efforts and genius, we would not be privileged to participate in this remarkable event. Please join me in welcoming Chris as our moderator.
Thank you, Dean Appleby, for those kind words and for introducing this event and for your support over these many months. Thank you, each and every one of you in the audience, for being with us today. Our time together is the culmination of an initiative across the Notre Dame community to engage Mohamedou Ould Slahi's story as told in his memoir, Guantanamo Diary. Our co-sponsor organizations took up the challenge to get this memoir into the hands of as many Notre Dame students as possible. So as a result, dozens of you explored the book in small group discussions Friday afternoon, hosted by the Center for Social Concerns. The Keough School Global Policy Seminar sessions on Friday focused on Mohamedou's story, with our center's international human rights lawyers joining in. Notre Dame's first-year students in the University Merit Scholarship programs are here with us as part of their ethical leadership course. And our audience includes undergraduate scholars from the Kellogg International Scholars Program, the Hesburgh-Yusko Scholars Program, and the Glynn Family Honors Program. And many of us, just a couple hours ago, were deeply moved by the devised performance entitled Transferring Guantanamo, just next door in the Philbin Studio Theater, performed by students taught by Professors Anton Juan and Ann Garcia Romero of the Department of Film, Theater, and Television. I want to thank the Liu Institute for Asian Studies and the Keough Naughton Institute for Irish Studies for their co-sponsorship, as well as the support of many participating organizations with us today. And I extend a special thank you to the DeBartolo Performing Arts Center team and the CCHR's own Kevin Fye and Ann Rurden for pulling this together so well. Thank you. This is a recorded event and will be available on my center, the Center for Civil and Human Rights website, in the very near future. Now to introduce our guests. It's our honor to have Professor Juan Mendez with us this afternoon. As many in the audience know, he is a giant in the field of human rights and transitional justice. His many roles in service to the international community include Commissioner of the International Commission of Jurists, Advisor to the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on the Prevention of Genocide, and founding President of the International Center for Transitional Justice. Of particular relevance to our conversation today, he was detained illegally and tortured in his native Argentina, during which time he was an Amnesty International prisoner of conscience. More recently, he was the UN Special Rapporteur on torture and other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment from 2010 to 2016. This is a homecoming for Juan and his wife Sylvia, who's with us today, as Juan was the 4th director of Notre Dame Center for Civil and Human Rights from 1999 until 2004. And he led the center in sponsoring conversations on campus about the events of 9/11. On behalf of the center and your many friends and admirers in the audience, welcome back, Juan.
Thank you.
It's also my profound pleasure to introduce Larry Seams. Larry is one of our own, a graduate of the Notre Dame class of '81, majoring in English and Classical Greek. He went on to study poetry in the MFA program in creative writing at Columbia University. He has published scores of articles on human rights and cross-cultural themes and served for many years as the director of Freedom to Write and International Programs for the writers' advocacy organization PEN. He was also the principal author of the Torture Report website, sponsored by the American Civil Liberties Union, providing narrative accounts of coercive interrogation of detainees in U.S. custody since 9/11. And I'm staying tuned for his upcoming nonfiction book, published by HarperCollins, The Dark Unfathomed, exploring the question of accountability and the American character. In addition to Mohamedou, Larry is the reason we are here today. Larry visited Notre Dame in early 2016 to share his insights on censorship, secrecy, and accountability based on his experience editing Mohamedou Ould Slahi's first edition of Guantanamo Diary. As many of you know, Mohamedou's account of torture and inhumane treatment was written during his detention in Guantanamo Bay in a 466-page handwritten manuscript. His memoir, Guantanamo Diary, was edited by Larry and then published in January of 2015 while Mohamedou was still in prison. Guantanamo Diary was an international bestseller and has since been translated into multiple languages for publication in more than 25 countries. Through the horrific accounts of his treatment, including torture, Mohamedou's intensely profound resilience and indomitable humanity shine through. We all here at Notre Dame wanted to meet this man. So during Larry's visit to campus, we hatched a plan. If and when Mohamedou is released from Guantanamo, let's connect him deeply with Notre Dame. Mohamedou was in fact released and sent back to his native Mauritania on October 16, 2016, pursuant to the unanimous decision of the U.S. government's Periodic Review Board. He was never charged with a crime nor stood trial. Once home, Mohamedou wasted no time and got to work on the restored edition of his memoir. Blacked-out redactions were turned to gray, revealing the reconstructed text beneath. While it became clear that the U.S. government would not permit Mohamedou to travel to Notre Dame, we decided to bring Notre Dame to him via video conference. I'm now happy to invite Larry to the podium to invite his friend and our guest of honor, Mohamedou Ould Slahi.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chris, for everything that you've done to make this possible, and to the Center for Civil and Human Rights and the other co-sponsors, and to Juan Mendez for being here and for his life's work for human rights and accountability, and to all of you for coming today. I had a hard time preparing this introduction. It's a tricky business, it turns out, to describe someone's life when almost everything we talk about when we talk about that life shouldn't have been part of that life at all. When almost everything we know and everything we're describing comes not from the natural course of that life, but from its complete and unjustifiable interruption. This is how a proper introduction should go. Mohamedou Ould Slahi was born on December 31st, 1970 in Rosso, Mauritania, then a small town, now a small city on the Senegal River on Mauritania's southern border. He had 8 older siblings, 3 more would follow. The family moved to the capital, Nouakchott, as Mohamedou was finishing primary school, and his father, a nomadic camel trader, passed away not long after. By then, thanks to his father, Mohamedou was a Hafiz, one who has memorized the Quran, a prodigious feat of scholarship at any age. At 11, without his family's knowledge, he took the high school entrance exam. High school was a rare competitive thing, and students normally took the exam at 13. And he went on to attend the Lycée Arabe. As a child, I always wanted to teach and write, Mohamedou recalls in his introduction to the restored edition of Guantanamo Diary. My role models were my teachers. When I came home from school, I would gather the kids from my neighborhood who either couldn't afford school or whose parents didn't see it as necessary and offer them classes for free, recreating the lessons I had received earlier in the day. I used walls as my blackboard and charcoal when I ran out of the chalk I scavenged from school. My mother didn't like the whole setup, and the general unruliness of the kids who were my students did not help in winning her approval. I also developed a minor compulsion for writing. I would write things down anywhere and everywhere, random things I sometimes couldn't even remember writing. More than once, I was embarrassed when my friends found my intimate ideas scribbled in my notebooks and even in the margins of my school books. This compulsion, it turned out, didn't even require a pen. It got so I would trace my thoughts with my finger on my thigh or in the air by my side. Mohamedou was both a gifted student and a spirited, fun-loving kid. He had a passion for football, especially the German Bundesliga team FC Köln and the German national team. That passion and his aptitude for math led him to apply for and win a scholarship from the Karl Duisberg Society to study in Germany. He attended Gerhard Mercator University in Duisburg, earning a degree in electrical engineering and specializing in microelectronics and telecommunication. He remained in Germany for almost a decade, working as a process engineer, and then he returned to Mauritania to live and work there in the year 2000. Here's a picture of Mohamedou. Here's a picture of Mohamedou showing me how the headmaster would ring the makeshift school bell at his elementary school. Next. Here's Mohamedou in his high school classroom. Next. And here is Mohamedou in 2 of his favorite places, the beach in Nouakchott. Next. And the beautiful dunes of the Sahara just outside the city. Next. And here he is at the doors of his family's home. Next. This was a life that was interrupted on November 20th, 2001. Next. That is the day Mohamedou drove this car to the National Police Headquarters in Nouakchott, voluntarily agreeing to come in for questioning. This is where he parked that car. This is what happens to a car that doesn't move in 15 years. For that 15 years, that interruption of Mohamedou's life is why we are here today. It was during that interruption that I came to know Mohamedou, not as friends normally do through shared adventures and long, lazy conversations, but through his writing. Although I was not permitted to see him or to speak to him or to write to him in the 5 years between the time I received his manuscript and when he was released, our friendship developed during that time in the way that all of my best and most rewarding friendships have developed, from a recognition of shared sensibility to deep admiration and trust, and finally, to a realization of how much my own experience and my own thinking had been shaped and enriched by his heart and vision. Now I am lucky enough to know Mohamedou in his life outside this interruption. About 2 hours after he was unshackled and led down the ramp of a US military plane to be reunited with his family, I was laughing with him on WhatsApp. We have been talking and laughing ever since. One of the things we have talked about often is the subject we will be talking about today. It is a subject I reflected on in my notes on the text of the restored edition we started working on the moment he was released. I thought I would close with that reflection. 5 years after I was first handed a disc with the censored version of Mohamedou's handwritten manuscript, I still struggle to fathom the scope and intensity of that ordeal and what it says about my country's commitment to the core human rights values of due process and freedom of expression. But every day I have lived with that manuscript, and now, to my great fortune, with the living presence of its author, I have understood Guantanamo Diary as a profound gesture of reconstruction and of hope. One evening during my visit to Nouakchott, a few weeks after his release, Mohamedou stood at the back gate of his family's weathered home on the edge of the Sahara, reenacting the events of the evening of November 20th, 2001, when he said goodbye to his mother and aunt, assured them he would be home in a few hours, and climbed into his car and started toward the police station. By sheer unnerving accident, we realized as we were standing there that it was 15 years to the hour since his fateful odyssey began. Time telescoped, I saw him both at the beginning and the end of his journey, and I recognized in the slightest slump of his shoulders its enormous weight. I have felt that weight many times since as we worked our way through the process of undoing the damage US government censorship had done to the story he tells in Guantanamo Diary. Now that the restored edition has been published, his long quest to tell this story is complete. Speaking not as an editor, but as an American citizen, I see other reparations work that remains to be done. But Mohamedou has done his part. The rest is up to us. To help us think through the question of what that work might be, and to share a little bit of his life with us, please join me in welcoming my colleague, my brother, and my incredible friend, Mohamedou Ould Slahi.
It's a long way to Mauritania. I think that's Here he is, wonderful.
Actually, I must confess, since this is Notre Dame, the first thing I would do is a confession.
All right, we're ready.
So I heard the delay was not really that long, and it's almost instantaneous, but I didn't know, should I talk immediately after Larry, or should I wait a little bit? And then I was stuck in that purgatory until I heard Chris talking.
All right, great. Well, welcome, Mohamedou. And I have to just say, I like your T-shirt. It's All right.
Yeah,
well, it's wonderful that this has worked, that you're with us. We might be having images come and go, but as long as you can hear us, we're good to go. So, Mohamedou, could you set the stage for the audience about how you got on the radar of the United States as someone with ties to terrorist groups?
Thank you very much. First, I would like to thank you so much for having me. I would like to thank the Center for Civil and Human Rights at the great University of Notre Dame. I would like to thank the Dean, Mr. Appleby. I would like to thank you, Chris. You've been working so hard to have me. I would like to thank that guy behind the scene, Kevin Fay. And I'm so honored to be with Professor Juan Mendez in this set. And last but not least, my brother. And I repeat, my brother, Larry. So Larry and I, we have known each other through the manuscript, as he said. It's a manuscript. It's like WhatsApp. You know, just picture WhatsApp. You want to get to know someone and just to send them a very long message and you never get any answer or anything. That's everything you know about it. And,
that's great.
So So this whole thing started with a phone call. I call it the infamous telephone call. It was actually a couple of phone calls, but I don't know which one led to the tragedy, the whole ordeal. It was between late in 98 and early 99. My cousin, a man by the name of Mahfouz, known for the American intelligence as Abu Hafs, called me in Germany. Then I was living in Germany with my wife and working. And he called me, he wanted me to help him transfer some money to his sick father. And I did that a couple of times for him. This was fine and dandy, as they say in the US, but except there was a small problem, a small technicality. The man called me with a phone that was registered under the name of Osama bin Laden in Sudan. And I did not know any of that. I had no clue. He was putting me at this great risk. And so the United States government, the agencies, they called the German government, and they called the Mauritanian government. So he made two phone calls, one to me, and another was to my cousin, to a cousin of us, who was working for him in Nouakchott. So my cousin was arrested immediately. And I was not arrested since the German asked the American to provide them a reason for my arrest or questioning. And American government failed to provide anything. And the German government said, we cannot arrest someone because someone called him with a phone number that is under someone you want to question or arrest. It's not a reason. So, and then I remained free, at least for the time being. And the tragic thing that the Mauritanian government, where I live now, didn't even ask for any due process to arrest my other cousin. They just went to the house when they were asked by Americans to arrest him. They arrested him. And he remained in prison for some time before he was released. So, but what happened that the German government made their investigation and came to the conclusion ultimately that I haven't done anything in Germany or outside of Germany to their knowledge that warrant my arrest or even my questioning. But life was really bad after that because Germany really, they didn't want to have any trouble with the US. They'd rather have me live on my own accord. So, and I had that feeling. And because my visa wasn't extended, and I did not sense the danger to ask for asylum. Honestly, looking back, I really should have asked for protection from the US government, but I didn't think this would happen, you know. And I always say, if I knew future, I would have been much better man. And so I moved to Canada on the suggestion of a friend of mine who went to the same university as me in Germany. He immigrated to Canada and I did. And as if trouble always was waiting on me, at the same time when I get to Canada, there was this man who obviously was a very disturbed man mentally, who tried to cross to Canada and kill innocent people. And he went to the same mosque that I went to in Canada. And because then it was Ramadan time, and the mosque needed a lot of volunteers. And I used to be to serve as imam. Imam is a priest, a Muslim priest. So, and ever since my teenagehood, you know, I think they call them altar boy in the United States. So I was like that. So, and it's something that came to me. I did not seek it. So, and they said, you used to be like that in Germany. I said, yeah. I said, okay, we can use you in Ramadan. I said, okay. And then, so the US government said, this guy is really very bad. He had the perfect cover, and he's our guy. We need him. And then they hatched a plan with the Canadians. So the Canadians said, again, that they cannot arrest me. But they did everything but. So they hatched a plan to get me outside of the country to a place where the United States could order governments to arrest people outside the rule of law. And so my family, my government spoke to my family called me and said, you need to get back to the country, your mother is very sick. And I went back, and I was kidnapped from Senegal, and I never recovered. So it went downhill from there.
It went downhill from there.
That's how I
Thank
get
you.
To
Yeah.
the radar.
Yeah.
It's very logical. You cannot blame the government.
So Juan, how does Mohamedou's story reflect patterns in how the U.S. identifies suspects who ended up at Gitmo?
Well, it's hard to tell because all the arrests under the so-called global war on terror have been mired in secrecy and still are mired in secrecy. Of course, intelligence operations are like that. But one thing we can tell, not only from the story that Mohamedou shares with us, but for the stories of several others, that mostly the process was obtaining cooperation from other intelligence services. Most of the people who were in Guantanamo were delivered to the United States by friendly intelligence services. And delivered not through the regular process of extradition, where at least you look at whether somebody has some elements of relationship to a crime. What's interesting to me is that there were something like 800, at the height of the global war on terror, about 800 inmates in Guantanamo, and today there are 41. Of those, all others were, like Mohamedou, cleared, quote unquote, for release, sometimes spending years in a cleared status. Of the 41, only 10 are facing charges before military commissions that are incredibly unfair in terms of criminal procedure. So if 10 of 800 are facing charges, you can tell that the process of deciding who was to be arrested and prosecuted was completely flawed. I mean, there was really no basis. Very few of those people were caught in battle, and yet they were considered by the Bush administration enemy combatants. Many more, of course, have been brought to the territorial United States and are facing charges before federal courts or have been convicted before federal courts. But even then, the majority have been convicted after plea bargaining and confessing to crimes. And so we don't really know what evidence was there. And besides, they pleaded after sometimes 2, 3, and 4 years of being held in solitary confinement, only to be held in solitary confinement under the euphemism of special administrative measures, SAMs, after being convicted. So there's still a lot we need to know about how this process evolved and how flawed it was from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Larry, do you want to talk about the reliability of U.S. intelligence used to detain these individuals?
I mean, I think, you know, as Juan said, the sad statistics that have unfolded over the years are quite, you know, speak quite eloquently about how little we knew about the men we detained. Mohamedou's story was one of, you know, kind of arrest the man and then we'll find some crime later. And so he, throughout his interrogation ordeal, he's variously alleged to have been involved in the Millennium Bomb plot in Canada. Later, the US tries out the idea that he was a recruiter for 9/11 hijackers. They return to the Millennium plot. You know, the landscape is shifting, but you know, I think there's an element to this that we shouldn't sugarcoat, and it's really sort of captured in a scene in the book that was actually quite a wonderful scene in the performance we saw earlier, in which an FBI agent comes to Mohamedou in Guantanamo and hands him a list and says, these are the 15 worst people in Guantanamo, and you're number one. And Mohamedou says, you got to be kidding me. And the FBI agent says, no, I'm not. Don't you understand the seriousness of your case? Mohamedou says, so you kidnapped me from my house in my country, sent me to Jordan for torture, then took me from Jordan to Bagram, and I'm still worse than the people you captured with guns in their hands? Yes, you are. You're very smart. To me, you meet all the criteria of a top terrorist. When I checked the terrorist checklist, you passed by a very high score. I was so scared, but I always tried to suppress my fear. And what is your FBI checklist? You're Arab, you're young, you went to jihad, you speak foreign languages, you've been in many countries, you're a graduate in a technical discipline. And what crime is that? Look at the hijackers. They were the same way. So that, there's a word for that. That's profiling, right? And that pattern, which I think is based on, not only a bad understanding of the geopolitical actors who are involved in 9/11 particularly, but there's also some cultural bigotry at play. And I think that kind of profiling has trickled down and seeped out in ways that permeate not just post 9/11 detention policies, but in immigration and refugee policies as well. And so I think we need to be very, really recognize that there was, that part of the driver of the treatment that Mohamedou was subjected to was not only bad intelligence, but also a bad cognitive framework based often on bigotry and cultural prejudice.
Thank you. So Mohamedou, fortunately we have your book, which tells this story of bigotry and prejudice. Could you talk about your decision to write about your experiences while in Gitmo and what that process was like?
Like my brother Larry mentioned in other writing of mine, I really always, as a child, I had this minor compulsion of writing everywhere. I write in my notebooks, I write on walls, I write on anything I touch, I write stuff on. So, and sometimes it was embarrassing. It wasn't a difference when I get to Guantanamo Bay, because Guantanamo Bay was the first real prison with structure and so, because secret prison, it was like a grave, because there was nothing. It was very surreal. It was like, just picture that you are in a grave, but you're still alive. So, and you have other concern of survival and so. And so in Guantanamo Bay, I said, okay, I need to write. This is a democratic country. And I have the right to express myself, no problem. Everything is okay. And then, but they said, you cannot have a pen. Then I start to steal pens from my neighbors. If they put a neighbor, I steal the pen, and then I steal paper too, and then I write, and then I hide it in myself. And then in June 2003, they found all my secret writing, and they confiscated it. They took it away. So what I wrote was very random stuff. I write about what happened, and then I write, when I hear English words, I write them so I could memorize them. And then I write notes because I used to teach other detainees, like other stuff, mostly Arabic language for foreigners, and Quran for other detainees. And so they took everything away. And then one day, I was with a Sergeant First Class, Charlie. And he was very intelligent person. He's an Iraq veteran. And I was so nervous and scared, and then I kept writing, like shaking and writing at the same time, very quickly. But I was writing on myself, on my clothes, and so I didn't know what I was writing. And then he said, "What are you writing?" So I'm using my own language, because his language was a lot of effing, and so I could say it, but because I'm very good at cursing, that's the first thing I learned in Guatemala. So But he said, what the F in your writing and so on. Then I didn't say anything. Because if I say, I don't know, then I give him an answer. But I don't want him to know anything. So I didn't say anything. And then he stood me. And then he said, if you don't stop, I will punish you. I didn't say anything either after that. And then they took very special stuff, to shackle me in a way that my hands couldn't move. But still, my hands kept moving. So the point here, I found myself in a situation where the king decides my fate. There was no outside arbiter. I will tell you one thing. America is really great country because many years ago, you decide that you don't want the king to decide over your life. You know why? Because it's bad. You need outside arbiter, and that outside arbiter I was deprived of. And this is actually a policy of the government that after 9/11, democracy does not work. And to use the words of some congressman, the only person who fought against, I think, Patriot Act, I think it was one person, at least one of them. He said that Al-Qaeda won the war without US firing one single shot, or Al-Qaeda firing one single shot. And this is very true, And it's because America said, with getting nothing back, they said, we're giving away our rights. We don't need democracy. Democracy does not work. That was the loudest message you could send, to the world. So I found myself in that situation, and I have a problem because I know what dictatorship looks like because I grew up in a dictatorship. I know what a democracy looks like because I went to Germany as a teenager. So what I saw in Guantanamo Bay was a dictatorship, the tactics, everything. So I wanted arbiter. But since I didn't get any, I want to use the whole world as my arbiter. That's why I decided to write the book. It took many years before my lawyers came to me in 2005. And then I saw my window and I started writing like crazy in a series of letters. And the rest of the story. It took many years until the government gave my lawyers this heavily redacted version of my writing.
Right. In fact, it took 8 years for your manuscript to be published. And even today, Larry, we might consider it a book as prisoner. So could you talk about the remarkable journey of the manuscript and about how it's still held hostage?
Well, Mohamedou's quite right that this would not have happened at all if it had not been for the fact that attorneys were allowed to visit Guantanamo prisoners in 2005. And that window that opened was a kind of a weird little procedural window in what happened to materials that Guantanamo prisoners created. Because in Guantanamo, every single word, every single thought, every single gesture, every single sneeze of a Guantanamo prisoner is considered classified from the moment it goes into the earth. It's just presumptively classified. And all of that material, the government can come into your cell and take it away at any time, as they did, as Mohamedou described with his earlier versions of his writing. But when they allowed attorneys to come in, if you handed your attorney some materials, it moved into this protective umbrella of attorney-client privilege. Now, it still couldn't get to the public because the attorneys, in order to be a Guantanamo attorney, you have to have a top secret security clearance, and you're not allowed to quote a conversation with your client. You're not allowed to tell the public what he said. Mohamedou, he talks about an arbiter. The way that the world kept prisoners from having an arbiter is to impose a cone of absolute secrecy around these places in which torture was happening. That was the strategy. But because attorneys were allowed in, this material was protected. All these materials would get shipped off to a warehouse outside of Washington, D.C., where all of the detainee art and writing and everything was stored. And then sometimes a little crack would open and the attorneys could get them released in order to be sent to their families or something. Well, Mohamedou's attorneys, particularly Nancy Hollander and Teresa Duncan, who are the real heroes of the Manuscript story, fought as part of his habeas corpus case to require the government to get the manuscript released. And finally, 2012, Mohamedou won his habeas case in 2010. By 2012, the US government had released so many documents, thanks mostly to the Senate Armed Services Committee report, which has quite a long section specifically on Mohamedou's torture, that the government could no longer pretend that the story he tells in Guantanamo Diary was not true. And at that point, they agreed to allow a heavily redacted version of the manuscript to be released. The government still holds five other manuscripts that Mohamedou wrote. They still hold the original manuscript, so we could not, the thing obviously to do would be to get the original manuscript back and just fill in the blanks, but we couldn't do that. We had to work from reconstruction rather than doing it. And just one quick note, today, right now, in January of 2018, it would not be possible to get Mohamedou's manuscript, because as of about 2 months ago, the Pentagon announced that it was shutting down the process that would allow any Guantanamo prisoner materials to be released to the public. They were doing this in reaction to the fact that there was an exhibition of paintings by Guantanamo prisoners in New York, and out of exasperation with the fact that that was getting a lot of press attention, and that press attention was emphasizing the fact that the men who are still there are actual human beings whose lives are ebbing away. The United States announced that it was no longer going to allow that material that sits in that warehouse to be cleared for public release. So we're lucky we got the manuscript when we did. It's outrageous that we don't have everything else that Mohamedou has written.
Yeah. Juan, do you want to say something about the window? Give us a window into the importance of this channel of communication for detainees, their legal representation, their lawyers.
Yeah, like in many parts of the world, you know, the lawyers are the first, defense of human rights in conditions of, torture and arbitrary arrest. I think, in fact, one silver lining of this very terrible story is in the United States, from day one, lawyers and legal organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union and the Center for Constitutional Rights fought every inch of the way against these injustices and this torture. I am particularly impressed with the lawyers that accepted representation of people held in Guantanamo, some military lawyers and some civilian lawyers, and they've done heroic work, because they have not only opened a little bit of the window onto what really was going on in Guantanamo with their clients, but they, as in the best tradition of lawyering, they put the interest of their clients before everything else. And that meant for many of them career-ending jobs, being forced to work on procedures that are completely unfair to their clients and to them. I've had the privilege of meeting several of them, both military and civilian lawyers, and I am still in touch with them. Unfortunately, I was never, when I was a special rapporteur on torture, I was never invited to visit Guantanamo, or at least I wasn't invited on conditions that were something less than a Potemkin village kind of visit, and so I couldn't accept. But at the same time, I am still proposed, at least as an expert witness on procedures before military commissions, and I am very, very impressed with those lawyers. And I have to stress that we know quite a bit of what happened in Guantanamo through them, but they are operating under such strict conditions of confidentiality and secrecy, and that what we know is, just a glimpse of what everything else that we need to know. So it's very important that we all remember that we need to continue to insist on full disclosure of everything that can be disclosed about what happened to people in Guantanamo, including questions of guilt or innocence, because we can only move forward and have a more enlightened and a better policy against terrorism if we learn from the mistakes of the recent past.
Yeah. Thank you, Juan. Mohamedou, I want to ask you one more question about your book and about your role as author. Near the end of your book, you wrote, "I have only written what I experienced, what I saw, and what I learned firsthand. I have tried not to exaggerate nor to understate. I have tried to be as fair as possible to the US government, to my brothers, and to myself." Was it hard to do this, to tell your truth as you were writing? And what did telling the truth in this way mean for you? How did it affect you?
Truth is a very powerful weapon. And truth is a weapon that I have in my arsenal that the government does not have. I know that because I know who I am. The government cannot know more than I do about myself. And I cannot fight the government with their own weapons because I'm outmanned. They have more weapons than me. They have more pressure. They have TVs. They have military. They have dictators on payroll. But I have the truth. And I really do believe that in the end, the truth always wins. It may take time, actually, but in the end, it wins. And as someone who is academic and someone who writes, it's a responsibility to report the truth. It's my responsibility. That's my job, to say everything as accurate as I could. That's why I always observe everything, like even the temperature, when they drove down the temperature of the AC to keep me cold, I looked everything, and I kept it in my head. And I also tried to read the names, read everything because I want to accurately report. The tactic of this repressive regime, like in my country and in Guantanamo Bay, is deceit and lies and secrecy. Everything is secret. And I never understand. So you say I'm a bad guy. Why don't you take me to a court and show the whole world that I'm a bad guy? This way, no one has any problem with you, But no, I'm really a big believer that democracy dies in darkness. Yeah. And that's exactly what they want. They want everything dark. And I said, I have everything to gain when I tell the truth. Yeah. And nothing to gain and everything to lose when I lie or report inaccurately. And it was very tempting because people would say, maybe it happens. But says, no, that's what happened is the way. And again, I'm not saying what I said is how the world, how events went down. But what I say and will say tomorrow is that's how I saw stuff going, and I invited everyone to read my book who was involved and comment. Yep. And all the comment I had so far from people who work there, some people contacted me and they agreed. And
right. And you have an amazing attention to detail and a memory for detail. And this is for Juan, a question. We know that polygraph tests are unreliable, but Mohamedou writes poignantly about how this test was his last hope to get his tormentors to accept his truth. How should we think of the polygraph being the mechanism of finding the truth here?
Well, there's a very good reason why polygraphs are inadmissible in a court of law, not only in the United States, but everywhere. There's not a legal system in the world that accepts polygraphs as a source of evidence. And the good reason is that they are eminently unreliable. There are people who know how to beat the machine, and there are people who confess to crimes that they did not commit because of the polygraph itself. Now, of course, they have some marginal utility. For example, if you're applying for a job that has a very high security clearance, because for those jobs the government doesn't want people who have secrets to hide, etc. So maybe some use of polygraphs can be justified under some circumstances. But one thing that can ever justify the use of polygraph is interrogations that are adversarial in nature, where you're actually trying to determine the guilt or innocence of the person that you are trying to interrogate. But I think the fact that Mohamedou passed the polygraph test when he was saying that he had not committed the crimes that he had previously confessed to, obviously adds to his credibility because he passed the polygraph test. But let's make it clear, even if he had failed the polygraph test, these confessions were worth nothing because they were obtained under torture. And the legal posture of the United States should be that there was no need for a polygraph test. They should have discarded confessions obtained under torture. That is the international standard and the American standard for admissibility of evidence. And so polygraph or no polygraph, what's wrong here is not only that they asked him to pass a polygraph test, but also that they were dealing with evidence obtained under torture to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Juan. And I want to pivot now. You mentioned this cone of secrecy that surrounds Guantanamo. And I'm going to ask you, Mohamedou, could you share your thoughts about all the people you met who were working at Guantanamo, who struggled against what they saw as wrong, as even evil, yet are silenced by the confidentiality agreements that they were forced to sign before working at Gitmo? I think of the example of the guard saying to you, "I know I can go to hell for not letting you pray." What did they teach you, and what do you think you taught them?
That guard was Specialist Edmund. How I get to know his name was, I couldn't see names, and so one time he was a little bit lazy. And the first thing I saw in American culture, they eat like 24/7. I would eat 24/7, honestly, but I didn't have food to eat so much. So they keep always like eating something. So the first time when I thought there was a party because they had a lot of chocolate and like soda and stuff all around them. I said, wow, this is a party and so. And actually, I was so naive, I thought they would reach and give me something. That did not happen. But there was no party either. So he asked me one day to clean their area, his area. And then I went inside, and then I was so happy because I want him to get me outside of myself. And then I went there, then I cleaned. Then I saw his name on, because where he put his jacket. So, and he told me to call him Jedi, the Master Jedi. I said, okay, I call you Master Jedi. And so he told me that he was observing me. So, and then we start talking. First, he gave me a soda because when I cleaned everything, and he gave me a soda. I think it was a Pepsi. Pepsi, I think it was. So, and then it was cold and it was good. It was my first Pepsi in 4 years, about 4 years. And so then we start talking. I said, look, but in your country, no, he first started. He said, you know, my wife is, she called me, she said she wants to be a Muslim. And then I told her, no freaking way. You ain't going to be a Muslim and so. And then I was laughing and I said, isn't it like allowed in your country, like freedom of speech and so? He said, yeah, I know, but I don't want to get in any trouble. Then I said, so you believe and so? He said, yeah. I said, so why did you stop me from praying and so? You know that was not good. He said, yeah, I know I'm going to hell, but I have to do my job because, and this is the point. He said, I could refuse to do that, but if I refuse, they will give me a very bad job in the military, and they won't trust me anymore. So I just have to very much bite the bullet and do this bad stuff. And this was echoed over and over with other interrogators. And so Mary, Staff Sergeant Mary, told me very openly that she knew that this was not quote unquote healthy for the United States of America. I was very provocative. I said, you know that like those people who operate with you, like Germany, they hate you guys. And she said, I'd rather have people hating us, kick their tail, and then laughing at us. We don't need anyone laughing at us. But it was obvious that she was just upset.
Yeah, that's wonderful that you were able to establish that connection with them. And I think we all can think about them also as other victims, collateral damage of what's going on there. So Mohamedou, I want to talk now, my last question for you is about your journey of forgiveness. In the first video of you, after your release in October 2016, you wholeheartedly forgive everyone. And in the restored edition of your book, you repeat and affirm your message that you hold no grudge against any of the people mentioned in your book. Could you share with us a bit of your journey of forgiveness from when you were first abducted until now?
First, I would like to double down on what I said. And that is really my sentiment. And I wasn't like that in the beginning. In the beginning, I really want revenge. I want to get back. I want to visit pain upon those who visit pain upon me. Then I was always fantasizing about how could I get it? How could I get back at them? So, you know, to be honest, I grew up in a tribal culture. So where for millennia, tribes fought against each other. And then if you kill one of these tribes, they go back and kill, not the killer necessarily, but another guy, you know? And this goes on and on. And this, just like after 9/11, when these atrocious crimes were committed against innocent people in New York and other cities, instead of the government, you know, sitting down and track down those who did this atrocity, they say, no, we just kill anyone, just who look like them, talk like them, and then just we kill it, and then we gain the confidence of American people, you know. And this, I know this culture because this is not in my time, but my father saw that my tribe fought against another tribe because they killed a guy from my tribe went back and killed another guy from the tribe. And so I'm aware of this, but with time I was thinking, fantasizing, studying, meditating, praying, and so, and voila, it was like enlightenment in my head. I said, I have everything, but I couldn't see it. And I found out that no revenge is as complete as forgiveness. And this is true. And when I decide I'm not going to ask anything back, I'm going to forgive everyone. And I do it for myself. I'm not doing it for anyone. And I'm aware that a lot of people, self-righteous people in the government would say, oh, we didn't do anything, we did our job. I would say, fine, I'm not charging you of anything. All I'm saying is the following. If you had done something wrong to me, I forgive you. If you hadn't done it, my forgiveness will not hurt you anyway. And yeah,
It's a very good point.
Again, yeah.
Yeah. So Larry and Juan, how does forgiveness relate to justice and accountability?
Well, first, let me say that forgiveness is a very admirable trait in anybody who has suffered as Mohamedou has suffered. And I think it's important to encourage forgiveness, but we have to remember that forgiveness is an individual act. It's what each person finds in his heart to forgive. And in our traditions, religious and moral, it should come after atonement. That is, somebody has to make a gesture so that somebody can forgive. And the other thing is, as a matter of international law, individual forgiveness is irrelevant to the obligation of the state to investigate, prosecute, and punish each crime against humanity, each act of torture. And the reason it's irrelevant is because we're not in a situation where blood money can solve things. We're not in a tribal situation anymore. We owe the obligation to investigate, prosecute, and punish, not to the victim alone, but we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to the institutions that we have created, we owe it to our children, our grandchildren that have to live in a country that is ruled by the rule of law and that doesn't deviate from that principle no matter what the emergency is. So the fact that individuals like Mohamedou forgive is, again, very admirable, but it does not relieve the United States government from its obligation to tell the truth about the global war on terror, to continue to expose what we know from the reports of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the Senate Committee on the Armed Forces, and to disclose all the redacted aspects and even hidden aspects of those reports, because at least in the case of the Select Committee on Intelligence, we have only an executive summary that is very heavily redacted. We need to continue to press for the truth, and the truth then can bear forgiveness. And finally, the state cannot expropriate forgiveness. It can and must expropriate revenge, but it cannot expropriate forgiveness. And when a state decides not to investigate, not to publicize, not to prosecute, and not to punish, it is actually expropriating forgiveness from the only persons who can really forgive, the victims. So again, we need to encourage forgiveness, but the way to encourage forgiveness is to come clean, to ask our leaders to tell everything that happened, because that would be the act of atonement that makes forgiveness real.
Larry, do you want to say anything?
I mean, there's little to add to that. I know when I first learned of Mohamedou's forgiveness, I was awed, and then my second thought was, that doesn't let us off the hook. That it does not let us off the hook. There is still work to be done, and I think it's both the legal obligations that Juan describes and the human obligations, the communal obligations, the restorative obligations. I like the fact that Sergeant Mary intuitively used the word healthy, right? This isn't a healthy thing I know this isn't healthy for my country. So, looking at accountability processes, I just thought I'd sort of mention two that are promising, that are happening. Accountability is slow. It's a difficult process. Any country that's has gone through a period of extreme human rights abuses fights for a long time to move through, to transition to justice and transparency. And we're doing that little by little, I think. There have been two main obstructions to accountability in the U.S., just mechanical obstructions. One has been the secrecy that we've talked about. And in particular, any time a plaintiff came into the courtroom to file suit for the treatment, especially that they had received in the CIA black sites, the U.S. government would come in and claim state secrets and say, that case can't even be heard or come to trial because it will endanger secrets of the United States. Well, especially thanks to the Senate Intelligence Committee report, just releasing the executive summary of that report, which for the first time, and this is the authors of that report, fought for every bit of turf they got in that report, and the one thing that they fought for above all was to be able to use the names of the survivors of specific techniques. And because their names were listed in a US government report, they were able to file suit. They sued the 2 CIA contract psychologists who designed the enhanced interrogation program, James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen. And just this past summer in a courtroom in Spokane, Washington, as the case was coming to trial, the case settled. And so for the first time since 9/11, survivors of victims of torture and the family of a man who was killed through torture in Afghanistan have received restitution for what happened. And the other one is we don't need to wait for our government to do this. This does not have to be a government process. And Juan and I, about a month and a half ago, were in North Carolina for an extraordinary thing called the North Carolina Citizens Inquiry on Torture. And that is actually a culmination of a 10-year effort by local residents in Smithfield, Raleigh area, North Carolina, because they learned in 2005 from the New York Times that their little country airport, single runway airport, in the hangar of that airport was a company called Aero Contractors, which was a CIA front company that was flying a business jet, a Gulfstream business jet, that was renditioning men to torture. One of the men in that rendition was Mohamedou. He was flown on that jet from Jordan to Bagram. Those citizens, when they found that, began to protest. They staged civil disobedience. They got arrested. They handed out citizens' indictments to their neighbors who were on the board of that Aero Contractors. They lobbied the state government in Raleigh, North Carolina. They got the faith communities all through North Carolina to bring pressure not only at the state level, but on Richard Burr, who was the minority member at the time, and Dianne Feinstein was the Democratic leader of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Because of that pressure, Richard Burr agreed to go along with the majority position to allow that Senate Intelligence report to be released. And now they're having the citizens' inquiry taking the place of what should have been an official government inquiry. And one of the things that they're looking at is specifically the question of reparation. What can we do as citizens to repair what's done? What does an apology look like from us? One of the amazing things they did was they set up at a booth at the North Carolina State Fair and had a petition of apology. And 800 people, ordinary North Carolina, signed their name to a petition that they sent to every man they could find who had been renditioned on one of these planes that were in their local airport. So there's a lot of work to do, but there's a lot of work that we can do, and there are models out there, not only in the national security area, but in local police, justice movements, restorative justice movements everywhere. So I think I said this at the beginning and I mean it now, I think this is, to a large extent, this is up to us.
Yeah, thank you. And Larry wrote a terrific piece for The Guardian about this example, and we'll get it on our website so that others can read about it. Hope you keep writing about it. So at this time, we have about 15 minutes left, and I invite 4 Notre Dame students to join us on stage, and each has prepared a question for our guests, all of our guests, including Mohamedou, to grapple with. So come on stage, students. And while they're coming on, I will introduce our first questioner. He is Joshua Pine. Joshua is a junior studying political science and Catholic social tradition. He was born on the east coast of China and spent his high school years in a Sufi Muslim village in northwest China. He has returned to China numerous times over the past 2 years, conducting research on issues related to rural development. You might spot him sporting a traditional Scottish kilt and the Notre Dame tartan as a member of the Irish Guard of the Notre Dame Marching Band. And Mohamedou, I'll explain that to you offline later.
But you've got to see it.
You've got to see it. Joshua.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Mohamedou, for being here with us. As someone who grew up in a deeply religious family and now attending a Catholic university, I was deeply encouraged and inspired to read about how you persevered in your faith and how it was a source of strength and hope for you during your trials. My question for you was, how does your faith impact the way in which you view your experiences, and as we talked about, your ultimate decision to forgive? And also on a personal note, what words of advice would you have for those of us who would seek to model the sincerity and integrity of your faith journey?
Thank you, Joshua. Look, faith grows with a person. So when I was a child, I saw faith and God as Aladdin and his magic lamp. So I ask for something, and it happens like that. I grow up to understand that the universe is much more complicated than that. So I remember one day, Joshua, I was really very distraught in my cell in Jordan, very secret prison. And they wouldn't allow me any contact. Even with Red Cross, I cannot talk to the Red Cross. They put me in a place where the Red Cross cannot see me. They hide me inside the secret prison. And then I said, oh God, now I will communicate through you with my family. Then I was thinking about the person who is the most reverent, the closest to God, to my belief. It was my oldest brother, because he took care of us, he provided for us when my father died. I was very young. And I told him, look, I'm here, and so and so. I don't know whether that message passed. And I don't know how, if it had, I don't know how it did. So I learned two things. The first thing that I have, so my job as someone who believes in God, a Muslim, is to go with nature, to go with God and be patient and understand that I'm just a small piece of puzzle, and I need to find my place in this universe and where I perfectly fit. That place I found in prison. That is to be someone who is completely dedicated to human rights and to human dignity. That's what would please God in my eyes. I have no doubt about that. Forgiveness. Well, I'm not breaking any news to a Catholic university when I tell them that the Bible, as much Quran, encourages us to forgive. But after so many centuries, we still want revenge. And I think that this saying is attributed to Jesus Christ. No revenge is as complete as forgiveness. And revenge is a very bad business, and forgiveness, it's very good. Of course, when you find nothing, no one to help you, and God will help you. God is always beside you. But you have to understand that God is not Aladdin lamp. You have to be just flow with the universe and with nature.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Mohamedou. Our second question is from Alyssa Paler. Alyssa is a student in the inaugural year of Notre Dame's Keough School Master of Global Affairs program with a concentration in international peace studies. She is a Colorado native, co-founded a Young Women's Leadership and Peacebuilding program, and lived and worked in Thailand and Myanmar for over 4 years. Alyssa.
Thank you. Mohamedou's accounting of what happened to him while imprisoned at Guantanamo suggests to me that the U.S. views itself exempt from the international norms governing humane treatment of prisoners and internationally accepted views concerning indefinite imprisonment. What are 2 to 3 significant policy and practice changes that you view as necessary for the U.S. government to undertake in order to bring itself into compliance with international laws and norms governing the treatment of prisoners and prohibitions on torture?
I think it's directed to Juan. Yes, go ahead, Juan.
That's a very good question, Lisa. Thank you. Yes, this characteristic of the global war on terror that seems to say that the rules apply to everybody else but not to the United States is a grotesque version of the exceptionalism of the United States. Of course, exceptionalism can have a positive view. And in many ways, the United States deserves to consider itself exceptional. But exceptional in the sense that the rules don't apply is what really results in tragedies of the sort. What the United States needs to do, the United States needs to take its international obligations seriously. It needs to recognize that no state of emergency of any sort authorizes the use of torture or the use of arbitrary detention or the use of extrajudicial executions. It needs also to set the example for the rest of the world, because I can tell you, as the Special Rapporteur on Torture, I more than once heard public officials of other countries saying, why do you look at us? Why don't you go to Guantanamo? Why don't you put pressure on the United States? And worse, states saying, well, if the United States can do it, then it must be okay. We can do it too. So the United States needs to get back to being a pillar of the development of international human rights law. It needs to accept the jurisdiction of international courts and international treaty organs that decide cases on a quasi-judicial or a judicial basis. And particularly, it needs to continue to be a champion for human rights, and a champion that deserves to be a champion, in the sense that it can preach with the example, and it can tell other states not to torture, it can tell other states not to violate human rights, but it has to do it from the perspective of regaining the moral high ground and say, do not what we say, but do what we do.
Larry, did you want to say something?
I'll just give really quick bullet points for some very specific things, because I mentioned that there are, I think, two very specific obstructions. One was secrecy. Juan mentioned the Senate Intelligence Committee report. The US government should stop doing what it's been trying to do, which is try to destroy the 4,200 pages that we haven't seen, and should release those pages in an unredacted form, so that's part of the public record. Second thing is, which I didn't mention before, I forgot the second point, which is that in 2006, when the Congress passed the Military Commissions Act, it built into the Military Commissions Act specific language that bars Guantanamo prisoners from ever seeking redress in American courts. They cannot sue for if you were abused in Guantanamo, you cannot file an Alien Tort Claims Act in the United States. They should repeal that and allow the men to have access to the court. Third thing is to lift the oppressive confidentiality agreements that prevent the American men and women who serve in these places from talking about their experiences. Because we talk about the harms of torture, and it does not only harm the person who is on the receiving end of torture, but there are men and women who are suffering because they were forced to be in these rooms, in these interrogation rooms, carrying out these acts. Many of them have talked extensively behind the scenes, and a lot of the reason we have these government reports, we have this 5,000-page Senate report because many CIA agents themselves wrote cables on which this report were based, that were protests and complaints. They're barred by law from even talking about their anguish with their families. We need to lift that out, let these stories out, and then we can begin to heal.
Thank you, Larry. So our third question is from Mona Lisa. Mona is a human rights lawyer studying in our center's LLM program in international human rights law. In her native India, Mona works with community-based legal aid clinics focusing on the intersection of gender and labor rights. During law school, Mona headed a UN development program, Government of India Access to Justice Project. Mona, please ask your question.
My question is also directed to Professor Mendez. Mohamedou makes a very strong point about imbalance of power among states in his book, as a result of which his country could hand him over to the US. How can human rights be legally protected when there continues to be inequality of power that can derail guarantees of human rights embodied in conventions?
Well, I think it's important to hold states accountable for their collaboration with the global war on terror. It's almost incredible to realize that something like 54 different states collaborated in one way or another with extraordinary renditions until President Obama barred them. But it's also good to know that many of them have been exposed and therefore are probably reluctant to go back to that now that we are actually under the serious risk that illegal and immoral operations of that sort could be renewed. One thing that has already begun to happen is that when you hold a collaborative state accountable, at least the truth comes out about who put pressure, which powerful country put pressure on that country. In the European Court of Human Rights, there are several cases for torture in black sites and illegal torture centers. The first one against Macedonia, the case El Masri versus Macedonia. That's great because if you read the sentence by the European Court of Human Rights, it talks in no uncertain terms about US responsibilities for putting pressure on Macedonia to allow violations that were committed against a man who was also very innocent because it was just mistaken identity that caused him to be taken to Afghanistan, to be tortured, etc., and then returned to Macedonia to be released. In addition, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe has done very good investigation and research, and there are also cases against Poland, again, for the use of those secret detention centers. Again, unfortunately, those cases are not against the United States because the European Court doesn't have jurisdiction over the United States, but the very fact that they come out and that their language is very clear about who did what to whom is a real stain in the reputation of the United States. And I want to finish by saying that the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, that does have some form of jurisdiction over United States actions, has published excellent reports on Guantanamo, including not only specific instances of violations and torture, but also rebutting all the arguments that the United States has from time to time used for saying, for example, that Guantanamo is not under the jurisdiction of the United States because it's offshore. On that one, of course, the US Supreme Court itself has rebuked the Bush administration position on it. So there are cases out there and exercises of international, supranational jurisdiction on human rights that they're putting their little help into constructing a wall that hopefully will prevent the return of these, at least of the worst things that have happened during the global war on terror.
Thank you, Mona. Thank you, Juan, for that question. Our last question is for Mohamedou, and it's from Salvador Leyva. Salvador is a human rights lawyer studying for his LLM degree in international human rights law. And among many professional accomplishments, in 2015, he was the attorney for a migrant and refugee shelter in Tabasco, Mexico, where he handled cases related to asylum seekers and crime victims. Salvador, your question.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Mohamedou, you mentioned that you have already forgiven those responsible for the acts committed against you. However, related to the countries involved, that is to say the United States, Mauritania, and Jordan, what would you consider would be a just or integral reparation for the harm done against you and your fellow detainees?
Thank you, Salvador, for the question. This is not easy question for me. First, I saw my job as doing the right thing, mean forgiveness. And I have forgiven. That's all I could do. I think if the United States now come back and just give me back my passport and my papers they seized from me, that would be a great first step toward reconciliation. Instead of twisting the arms of my government and forbade them to give me back my papers, so that I could not talk to anyone, I could not go, for instance, to your university, I could not go to Europe, where I have so many invitations, and that would be a very good beginning. I mean, when Obama came to power, he made a very good executive order forbidding US agents from torturing people. You know, I don't like this executive order. Why? Because there were already laws in place for forbidding torture, international as well as American laws. All America needed to do is put them to use, apply the law. And this is a lullaby for the whole world, including American citizens. Oh, look, this is a great thing. He forbade agents to torture, so he doesn't need to take them to court and punish them. I think some type of reconciliation must take place.
Okay.
I think that once people died, some of my co-detainees died under torture, and some died indirectly from torture. The funny thing that we say about Guantanamo Bay, more people died from torture or the consequences of torture than people convicted in Guantanamo Bay. And almost all convictions were turned over, were defeated afterward. So this is very bad. But first and foremost, very bad for the United States, meaning bad for you, Salvador, for Lisa, for Mona, for Elisa, and for Joshua, and for all citizens of the United States of America, because you have a responsibility. The greatest quote from Spider-Man is, with great power comes great responsibility, you know. Like my country, when I go and ask for very simple things, they say, yeah, United States doesn't respect human rights, doesn't respect, why should we respect them? And the United States is a democracy. I cannot argue that point because as far as I know, the book told me that you are a democracy. And this is very painful for the rest of us in this part of the world. And I really would love for the United States, even for the sake of the United States, to do something. This is the biggest hit against organized crimes, including terrorism.
Thank you so much, Mohamedou. And thank you, students, for these thoughtful and thought-provoking questions. We're going to have a reception outside. I invite everyone to continue the conversation. I also want to let you know that copies of Guantanamo Diary Restored Edition is available for purchase, and Larry has agreed as the book editors to sign your copies. And before we close, Mohamedou, I had planned to read out, to repeat your invitation from the end of your restored edition in the author's note, and then something happened this afternoon at the fantastic devised performance next door. Senior Brandon Toon performed exactly what I had planned to read, beautifully and powerfully. And so for our last bit of this meeting together, I invite Brandon on stage for an encore performance. Mohamedou, can you see Brandon? Yes, all right.
When this book was first published, when Mohamedou was still in prison, he sent a message through the lawyers that appeared as an author's note in that edition of the book. That note said, "In a recent conversation with one of his lawyers, Mohamedou said that he holds no grudge against any of the people he mentions in this book, that he appeals to them to read it and correct it if they think that it contains any errors, and that he dreams to one day sit with all of them around a cup of tea after having learned so much from one another. I want to repeat and affirm this message here, and to say that now that I am home, that dream is also an invitation. The doors of my house are open."
Thank you, Brandon. Yes. So we're all left with this beautiful invitation and the challenge of responding to it. Our main event is now coming to a close. Please join me in thanking Mohamedou, Larry, Juan, and our students for this excellent discussion.